All right, next up is going to be the form and function of the female reproductive system. The structures of the female reproductive system include ovaries, oviducts, and fallopian tubes, uterus, vagina, external genitalia, and the breasts. We are going to be going into each one of these individually, but this figure right here does give you a very nice overview of all of the important structures and their function. So we're going to start off with the ovaries and the oviducts. The ovaries are going to be about twice the size of an almond. They're going to be responsible for producing eggs through a process known as oogenesis. They are also responsible for producing the sex hormones estrogen and progesterone. Oviducts are also known as the uterine tubes or the fallopian tubes. Their responsibility is going to be to transport immature egg from the ovaries to the uterus. This normally takes about 3 to 4 days for the egg to travel inside of the uterus. This is going to be the most common site for most common site for fertilization. The uterus is going to be our next organ. It is a hollow muscular organ that receives and nourishes the developing embryo. This wall has 2 layers. One will be a smooth muscle layer, the other will be the endometrium. The endometrium is going to be the site of implantation of the embryo. If the embryo is located outside of the uterus, then this is what is known as an ectopic pregnancy. It can be fatal for the mother, but it is always fatal for the infant. Ectopic pregnancies are very dangerous. If there is no embryo, then the endometrium layer is going to be shed during the menstrual flow. Before pregnancy, the uterus is going to be roughly the size and shape of an inverted pear. With pregnancy, it's going to expand to as much as 60% its original size. Uterus continued. The region of the uterus known as the cervix is going to be the narrow neck of the uterus that extends into the vagina. The vagina is going to be the area that receives the penis during or intercourse and serves as the birth canal during delivery.
The structures of the female reproductive tract produce eggs, receive sperm, and incubate, nourish, and deliver offspring. Here we see a cross-section or side view of the female lower torso. Let's begin with the external genitalia or labia. The labia majora is a fold in the skin that, together with the labia minora, conceals the opening to the vagina and urethra. Just in front of the labia is the clitoris, a small organ made of sexually sensitive erectile tissue. Between the labia are the vaginal opening and the opening to the urethra. The urethra and urinary bladder are not part of the reproductive system in females and have totally separate ducts. The vaginal opening leads to the vagina, also called the birth canal. Sperm are deposited in the vagina during intercourse, and a fetus moves through the vagina during birth. Moving upward, we see the cervix. This narrow lower part of the uterus must dilate during the birth of a baby. The uterus itself is a muscular, hollow, fist-sized organ within which the embryo implants and the fetus develops. The ovum is fertilized in the fallopian tube or oviduct, which connects the uterus with the area just next to the ovary. The ovaries, one on each side of the uterus, produce eggs and estrogens, the female hormones. Now consider the key structures of the female reproductive tract in front view. Note that only the ovaries and oviducts are paired. The rest of the system is single and centrally located. Let's examine the ovary in greater detail. The egg cells, or oocytes, lie in the outer portion of the ovaries. Each oocyte sits within a sphere of follicle cells that eventually provide nutrients. Together, each oocyte and its accessory cells is called an ovarian follicle. On average, only one of these follicles matures in each repetition of the menstrual cycle, passing through the stages of primary, secondary, and tertiary follicles. The oocyte contained in the mature follicle is expelled at the end of the process for a journey through the oviduct. With expulsion of the oocyte, the tertiary follicle is transformed into the corpus luteum, which for a time produces hormones that can aid in pregnancy. The release of an egg cell from the ovary into the oviduct is called ovulation. Once in the oviduct, the oocyte may encounter sperm and become fertilized by one of them. The fertilized egg, now called a zygote, then begins the process of development and completes its journey with implantation into the uterine wall. The menstrual cycle is a monthly sequence of ovarian and uterine events controlled by hormones secreted by the pituitary gland and the reproductive organs. The average cycle length is 28 days. During each cycle, an ovary releases an oocyte and the uterus is prepared for embryo implantation. If fertilization does not occur, a new menstrual cycle begins. The menstrual cycle consists of two phases, the follicular phase and the luteal phase. By convention, the cycle begins with the onset of menstruation, the shedding of the endometrium, the mucous membrane that lines the uterus. At the beginning of menstruation, the pituitary gland releases high levels of follicle-stimulating hormone, abbreviated FSH, and low levels of luteinizing hormone, or LH. FSH stimulates a follicle in the ovary to grow. The developing follicle produces low levels of estrogens and progesterone. The low levels of estrogen suppress LH secretion by the pituitary gland through feedback inhibition. Therefore, LH levels remain low while estrogen levels are low. By day 7, menstruation is over and the uterine lining begins to rebuild itself. As the follicle grows in the ovary, its production of estrogen increases. As the level of estrogen increases, it begins to exert positive feedback on LH levels. That is, instead of suppressing LH secretion by the pituitary, estrogen now stimulates LH secretion. The increased level of estrogen triggers a large spike in LH and a smaller spike in FSH that together signal the end of the follicular phase and the onset of the luteal phase. The LH surge triggers ovulation, the rupturing of the follicle. This event occurs on or around day 14. The secondary oocyte that emerges from the ruptured follicle is transported down the oviduct. In the ovary, the corpus luteum develops from the ruptured follicle. The levels of estrogen, FSH, and especially LH now drop appreciably. But in response to the previous surge in LH, the corpus luteum begins to secrete large amounts of progesterone and smaller quantities of estrogen. In combination, these hormones suppress the secretion of FSH and LH from the pituitary gland through feedback inhibition. With FSH levels so low, no additional follicles can mature during this part of the menstrual cycle. The rise in progesterone levels converts the thickened uterine lining to an actively secreting tissue with a well-developed blood supply, creating an environment that will support embryonic implantation and development if fertilization occurs. The corpus luteum remains active during the first part of pregnancy and keeps progesterone and estrogen levels high. When fertilization does not occur, the corpus luteum degenerates. Progesterone and estrogen levels fall as a result, causing the thickened uterine lining to degenerate as well. With progesterone and estrogen levels low, feedback inhibition on LH and FSH is removed. The levels of LH and FSH begin to rise. A new follicle then starts to mature, and the uterine lining starts to slough off. A new menstrual cycle begins. The structure.
So Table 17.3 goes through an overview of the various structures and functions of the female reproductive system. I'm going to just put into words so that way you can kind of have a written account of everything that you heard in the chapter, or in that video, about the ovarian cycle. The ovarian cycle is cyclical changes in an ovary that produce the egg. It is roughly 28 days long. All of the women's potential eggs have been formed prior to birth, and the number is going to decrease after birth. Beginning at puberty, one immature egg is going to develop. At approximately day 14, ovulation is going to occur. That's the release of an egg that is ready for fertilization. All of this is going to be directed by hormones. Here we've got a a cycle or a diagram of the ovarian cycle. At monthly intervals, the egg is going to mature and released from the ovary. The uterus, so that's going to be the ovarian cycle. The uterus is going to be ready to receive and nurture the embryo, that is the uterine or the menstrual cycle. These are two different cycles that do occur simultaneously but aren't necessarily always synced up. If fertilization does not occur, then the uterine provisions are discarded as menstrual flow. If fertilization does occur, then the human chorionic gonadotropin hormone is going to be produced by the embryo and help maintain that corpus luteum. The hormones of the corpus luteum maintain the endometrium, keep it from shedding. So the menstrual cycle is going to be the cyclic changes in the uterine wall to prepare for the possible embryo. This is also about 1 month long, 28 days, but it can vary in length. It is coordinated with the ovarian cycle, but separate from the ovarian cycle. It occurs in 2 phases, assuming that they're not pregnant. Menstruation occurs in days 1 through 7. This is the bleeding that's associated with the endometrium sloughing off. Then the second phase is going to be when the endometrium regrows and thickens, days 7 through 28. This is to prepare for the next potential fertilized egg. If the individual is pregnant, the endometrium will not be shed so that it can hold the implanted embryo. And again, this entire process is going to be directed by hormones.
Upon ovulation, a mature ovum travels from the ovary through the oviduct toward the uterus. Progesterone hormones are secreted by the burst follicle, now called the corpus luteum. Progesterone prepares the lining of the uterus for egg implantation and fetal development. In response to progesterone, the lining of the uterus, called the endometrium, thickens and blood flow to the uterine lining is maintained. Sperm released into the vagina travel through the cervix and uterus to meet the mature egg in the oviduct, where fertilization takes place. The embryo attaches to the endometrium. Progesterone continues to be made by the corpus luteum for 6 to 7 weeks until the placenta is developed and can take over progesterone production to support the growth of the fetus. If fertilization does not occur, the corpus luteum degenerates, halting the production of progesterone. The uterine lining becomes unable to support attachment of the mature egg. The egg and the uterine lining are expelled from the body during menstruation.